The boy's voice cracked like breaking glass in the mountain silence, and something dead inside Marcus Thorne suddenly clawed back to life. 3 years of hiding from humanity, 3 years of letting his heart freeze solid as winter stone. And now this trembling child stood at his cabin door with wolves circling and terror bleeding from his eyes. The mountain man who had sworn never to care again felt his soul tear open like an old wound, because some pleas cannot be ignored, some innocence cannot be abandoned, and some battles must be fought even when you have already lost everything that matters. The boy appeared like a ghost against the snow, his small frame shaking so violently that Marcus could hear his teeth chattering from 20 feet away. Blood stained the child's torn shirt, dark crimson against pale fabric, and his eyes held the kind of terror that only comes from watching death hunt you through the trees. Marcus had been splitting wood when the desperate voice cut through the mountain air like a blade, and now he stood frozen with his axe in hand, staring at this fragile thing that had somehow found his hidden sanctuary. The child could not have been more than 10 years old, with sandy hair matted against his skull and scratches covering his face like war paint, and when he spoke again, his voice broke with the weight of absolute desperation. The wolves had been tracking the boy for hours, their howls echoing through the canyon like promises of violence, and Marcus could see the exhaustion in every line of the child's body. This was not some lost hiker or confused traveler. This was prey being hunted by predators that knew exactly how to kill, and the boy's eyes held the terrible knowledge that he was running out of time. Marcus had spent 3 years in these mountains specifically to avoid moments like this, to escape the crushing weight of caring about another human being. But something in the child's face shattered every wall he had built around his heart. The boy took another stumbling step forward, his small hands reaching out like he was grasping for salvation itself, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed isolation crumble like sand. When the child whispered his plea again, the words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of absolute trust and desperate hope. This boy had somehow found the one man in 100 miles of wilderness, had stumbled through deadly terrain to reach a cabin that most people would never discover, and now he stood bleeding and terrified while wolves circled closer with every passing moment. Marcus could hear them now, their low growls drifting through the trees like death songs, and he knew that within minutes this child would either find protection or become another casualty of the mountain's endless hunger. The boy's eyes never left Marcus's face, as if he understood that this moment would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise, and the raw faith in that gaze made something long dead inside the mountain man suddenly roar back to life. The first wolf appeared at the tree line like a shadow given form, its yellow eyes fixed on the boy with predatory focus, and Marcus felt his body move before his mind could catch up. 3 years of self-imposed exile had not dulled his instincts, had not softened the warrior that still lived beneath his hermit's exterior, and when he saw that Wolf's muscles bunch for an attack, he knew that his time of hiding was over. The boy saw the beast too, and stumbled backward with a cry of pure terror, his small body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane, and Marcus realized that this child had probably been running from these creatures for hours without rest. The wolf's lips pulled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers, and its growl rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder, and Marcus understood that the next few seconds would determine whether innocence survived or died in the snow. The mountain man's hand tightened around his axe handle as more wolves emerged from the forest, their pack mentality turning them into a coordinated killing machine that had cornered its prey at last. The boy pressed himself against Marcus's cabin wall as if the rough wood could somehow protect him from the nightmare that had followed him through the wilderness, and his whispered prayers mixed with the sound of approaching death in a symphony of desperation. Marcus had sworn never to let another person depend on him, had promised himself that he would never again feel the crushing weight of someone else's survival resting on his shoulders, but this child's terror was breaking through every defense he had built. The wolves began to spread out in a hunting formation that spoke of intelligence and experience, and Marcus knew that they had done this before, had cornered other prey in other clearings and torn them apart with methodical precision. The boy's eyes met his one final time, and in that gaze, Marcus saw not just fear, but a terrible, beautiful trust that cut through his soul like a blade of pure light. This child believed that somehow, against all odds, he had found salvation in the form of a broken mountain man who had been hiding from the world for 3 years, and that faith was more powerful than any weapon Marcus had ever carried. The wolves were moving now, their paws silent against the snow as they closed the distance with deadly patience, and Marcus felt his heart begin to beat with a rhythm he had almost forgotten. He had thought his capacity for love was dead and buried, had believed that his soul was too damaged to ever care about another human being again, but this boy's desperate plea had awakened something primal and fierce and absolutely unbreakable. And Marcus Thorne realized that some battles choose you whether you want them or not. The first wolf lunged with liquid grace, its powerful body cutting through the air like a missile of fur and fangs, and Marcus met it with his axe in a collision that sent shockwaves through the frozen ground. The blade bit deep into the creature's shoulder, drawing a howl of pain and rage that echoed off the mountain walls, but the wolf's momentum carried it forward, and its claws raked across Marcus's chest in lines of fire. Blood bloomed across his flannel shirt like crimson flowers, and the metallic taste of violence filled the air, but Marcus had fought worse things than wolves in his lifetime, and his body remembered every lesson that war had taught him. The boy pressed himself deeper against the cabin wall, his eyes wide with terror and awe as he watched this stranger risk everything to protect a child he had never met, and something in that gaze gave Marcus strength he had forgotten he possessed. The pack circled with the patience of experienced killers, their yellow eyes reflecting the afternoon light like coins of malice, and Marcus could see the intelligence in their movements as they tested his defenses. These were not desperate scavengers, but apex predators that had learned to hunt as a coordinated unit, and they understood that time was on their side as long as they could wear down their human opponent. The boy's breathing came in sharp gasps that created small clouds in the cold air, and Marcus could feel the child's terror like a physical weight pressing against his back, reminding him that failure meant watching innocents die in the most brutal way possible. The wounded wolf had retreated but not fled, its shoulder streaming blood as it rejoined its pack, with hatred burning in its eyes. And Marcus knew that he had just made this fight personal in a way that would demand blood payment. The second attack came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that spoke of pack intelligence and hunting experience, and Marcus found himself spinning between snapping jaws and slashing claws in a dance of violence that pushed his reflexes to their absolute limit. His axe became an extension of his will, cutting through the air in deadly arcs that kept the wolves at bay, while his boots found purchase on the blood-slicked snow beneath his feet. The boys whispered prayers, mixed with the sounds of combat, creating a soundtrack of desperation and hope that drove Marcus forward, even when his muscles screamed for rest. One wolf managed to sink its teeth into his left arm, and the pain shot through his nervous system like liquid lightning. But Marcus used the creature's grip as leverage to drive his axe handle into its skull with bone-crushing force. The battle raged across the clearing like a storm of flesh and steel, with Marcus giving ground slowly while the boy remained pressed against the cabin wall like a fragile treasure that must be protected at all costs. Blood painted the snow in abstract patterns of violence, some of it wolf and some of it human, and Marcus could feel his strength beginning to ebb as the pack's relentless pressure took its toll. But every time exhaustion threatened to claim him, he would catch a glimpse of the boy's face and see the absolute trust that still burned in those young eyes, and that faith became fuel for a fire that refused to be extinguished. The wolves sensed his fatigue and pressed their advantage, their attacks becoming more aggressive as they smelled victory in the mountain air. But Marcus had survived worse odds in darker places, and his will to protect this child was stronger than any physical limitation. The turning point came when the largest wolf, a massive grey beast with scars covering its muzzle like badges of honor, decided to end the fight with a direct assault on the boy himself. The creature broke from the pack's formation and charged straight at the child, with killing intent blazing in its eyes. And Marcus felt something primal and unstoppable explode in his chest as he realized that this monster intended to tear apart the innocent life he had sworn to protect. Time seemed to slow as Marcus threw himself between the wolf and the boy, his axe forgotten as he tackled the beast with nothing but his bare hands and a father's fury that had been dormant for 3 long years. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and fangs, rolling through the snow as Marcus fought to keep those deadly jaws away from his throat. And the boy's scream of terror became the soundtrack to a battle that would determine whether love or hunger ruled this mountain. The wolf's strength was incredible, its muscles like steel cables beneath fur that had been hardened by countless winters. But Marcus fought with the desperation of a man who had found something worth dying for after years of believing he had nothing left to lose. His hands found the creature's throat and squeezed with every ounce of strength his body possessed, while the wolf's claws raked across his back in furrows of agony that painted his shirt with fresh blood. The other wolves circled this final confrontation like spectators at a gladiatorial contest, their pack instincts telling them to wait and see which alpha would emerge victorious from this primal struggle. The boy watched in horrified fascination as his protector and his hunter fought for the right to determine his fate. And in that moment, Marcus Thorne understood that he was not just fighting for a child's life, but for his own redemption. His own chance to prove that broken men could still choose to be heroes when innocence called their name. The wolf's death rattle echoed through the clearing like a final curse, and as its body went limp beneath Marcus's bloodied hands, the remaining pack members seemed to understand that their hunt had failed in the most decisive way possible. They melted back into the forest like shadows retreating from dawn, their yellow eyes carrying promises of future vengeance. But for now, the immediate threat had passed and the boy was safe. Marcus rolled away from the dead wolf and lay gasping in the snow, his body a map of wounds, and his chest heaving with the effort of staying conscious, while the child approached him with tentative steps that spoke of awe and gratitude too large for words. Blood seeped through Marcus's torn clothing like crimson rivers, and he could feel the mountain cold beginning to seep into his bones. But the boy's safety made every injury feel like a badge of honor, rather than a burden to bear. The child knelt beside him in the snow, his small hands hovering uncertainly over Marcus's wounds, as if he wanted to help, but did not know how. And when he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. He told Marcus his name was Samuel, that he had been traveling with his family when their wagon train was attacked by raiders who killed everyone except him, and that he had been running through the wilderness for 2 days with nothing but terror and determination keeping him alive. The wolves had found his trail on the second morning, and he had been fleeing from them ever since, following a stream that led him up into the mountains where he had spotted smoke from Marcus's chimney like a beacon of hope in an ocean of despair. His story poured out in broken fragments between tears, each detail painting a picture of tragedy and survival that made Marcus's heart ache with recognition and fury. Marcus struggled to sit up despite his injuries, his protective instincts refusing to let him remain vulnerable while the boy needed care. And he guided Samuel toward the cabin with movements that sent lightning bolts of pain through his damaged body. The interior was sparse but warm, with a stone fireplace that cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls, and Marcus collapsed into a wooden chair, while Samuel stood uncertainly in the doorway, like he was afraid this sanctuary might disappear if he moved too quickly. The mountain man's hands shook as he reached for his medical supplies. 3 years of isolation having made him forget how to care for another person. But Samuel's presence filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. The boy's eyes took in every detail of this refuge, from the simple furniture to the hunting trophies on the walls, and Marcus could see him trying to understand what kind of man would risk everything to save a stranger's child. As Marcus cleaned and bandaged his wounds with Samuel's help, the boy's story continued to unfold, like pages from a book written in blood and tears. His family had been heading west to start a new life, his father a carpenter and his mother a teacher, and they had joined the wagon train in Kansas with dreams of building something beautiful in the untamed territories. The raiders had come at dawn, like demons from hell, their faces painted with war colors and their hearts filled with a hunger for violence that made no distinction between man, woman, or child. Samuel had hidden beneath his family's wagon while the massacre unfolded around him, watching through gaps in the wooden planks as everything he loved was destroyed by men who killed for pleasure rather than necessity. He had waited until the raiders rode away with their stolen goods before crawling out to find himself alone in a world that had suddenly become a nightmare of blood and silence. The boy's resilience amazed Marcus more than his own survival of the wolf attack, because Samuel had endured losses that would have broken grown men, and yet still possessed the courage to trust a stranger with his life. As the mountain man worked to clean the child's wounds and feed him from his meager supplies, he found himself remembering what it felt like to care about another person's well-being, to feel responsible for someone else's happiness and safety. Samuel ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had not known where his next meal would come from. But his eyes never left Marcus's face, as if he was trying to memorize every detail of the man who had saved him from becoming wolf food. The cabin felt different with the boy's presence, less like a hermit's refuge and more like a home where two souls could heal from the wounds that life had inflicted upon them. When Samuel finally fell asleep by the fire, his small body curled up in Marcus's spare blankets like a cat seeking warmth, the mountain man sat watching over him with emotions he had thought were dead and buried. 3 years ago, he had lost his own son to a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could cure, and the grief had driven him into these mountains, where he could hide from a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. But this boy's trust had awakened something in Marcus that felt like resurrection, a sense of purpose that made his heart beat with rhythms he had almost forgotten. The firelight played across Samuel's sleeping face, highlighting the innocence that had somehow survived massacre and pursuit, and Marcus understood that he had been given a second chance to be the protector he had failed to be when his own child needed him most. Dawn broke over the mountains like a promise written in gold and crimson, and Marcus woke to find Samuel already awake, sitting by the window and watching the sunrise with eyes that held depths no child should possess. The boy had slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by memories of violence and loss, but something in his posture suggested that the night's rest had given him strength rather than simply exhaustion. Marcus's wounds ached with every movement, his body a testament to the previous day's battle, but seeing Samuel safe and alive made every injury feel like a small price to pay for such a precious victory. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and snow, clean and pure, in a way that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of yesterday's violence, and Marcus found himself thinking about the future for the first time in 3 years. The boy turned from the window with a smile that transformed his entire face, chasing away the haunted expression that had marked him since his arrival, and Marcus felt his heart clench with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him completely. Samuel had found clean clothes in Marcus's belongings, garments that hung loose on his small frame, but gave him the appearance of a child playing dress-up rather than a survivor of unspeakable tragedy. And his resilience continued to amaze the mountain man, who had forgotten that healing was possible. They shared breakfast in comfortable silence, the crackling fire providing a soundtrack to their meal, and Marcus found himself studying the boy's face for signs of the trauma that must surely be lurking beneath his brave exterior. But Samuel seemed determined to focus on the present rather than the past, his attention fixed on the simple pleasure of warm food and safe shelter, rather than the nightmares that had driven him to this mountain sanctuary. As the morning progressed, Samuel began to explore the cabin with the curiosity of a child who had been given permission to investigate a treasure trove, and his questions about Marcus's life revealed an intelligence that had been sharpened by hardship rather than dulled by it. The boy wanted to know about the hunting trophies on the walls, the books on the shelves, the tools that Marcus used to survive in this wilderness isolation, and each answer seemed to add another piece to the puzzle of understanding who this man was who had risked everything to save him. Marcus found himself talking more than he had in years, his voice rusty from disuse but growing stronger, as Samuel's genuine interest drew out stories and memories that had been locked away in the deepest corners of his heart. The boy listened with the intensity of someone who understood that every detail mattered, that these glimpses into Marcus's past were gifts to be treasured rather than casual conversation to be forgotten. When Samuel asked about the photograph on the mantelpiece, the one showing Marcus with a woman and a young boy who looked remarkably similar to Samuel himself, the mountain man felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. He told the boy about his wife Sarah and his son David, about the fever that had taken them both within a week of each other, about the grief that had driven him into these mountains where he could hide from a world that seemed determined to steal everything he loved. Samuel listened without judgment, his young face grave with understanding that seemed far beyond his years. And when Marcus finished his story, the boy reached out and took his hand with a gesture so simple and pure that it shattered the last of the mountain man's defenses. In that moment of connection, Marcus understood that Samuel had not just stumbled upon his cabin by accident, but had been guided there by forces that understood the healing power of two broken souls finding each other in the wilderness. The afternoon brought practical concerns that could no longer be ignored because Samuel could not remain in the mountains indefinitely, and Marcus could not simply pretend that the outside world did not exist. The boy needed to be returned to civilization, to authorities who could help him find surviving relatives or suitable guardians. But the thought of letting him go felt like tearing away a piece of his own soul that had just begun to heal. Samuel seemed to understand the dilemma without being told, his perceptive nature allowing him to read the conflict in Marcus's face, and when he spoke, his words carried a wisdom that made the mountain man's heart ache with pride and sorrow. The boy said that he understood Marcus had saved him for a reason, that maybe they had both been meant to find each other in this place where healing was possible, and that whatever happened next would be guided by the same forces that had brought them together in the first place. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to promise better days ahead, Marcus made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. He would take Samuel down from the mountains, would help him find a new life among people who could give him the stability and opportunities that a hermit's cabin could never provide. But he would not simply abandon the boy to the mercy of strangers who might not understand the strength that lay beneath his gentle exterior. Marcus had spent 3 years hiding from responsibility and connection, but Samuel's trust had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking heartbreak for, worth choosing love over safety for. The boy's presence had awakened something in Marcus that felt like resurrection, a sense of purpose that made him remember who he had been before grief had driven him into exile, and he understood that saving Samuel had also saved himself in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. The mountain man who had sworn never to care again found himself planning a future that included protecting and nurturing the child who had stumbled into his life like an answer to prayers he had been afraid to speak, and Samuel's smile in the firelight promised that some bonds forged in blood and desperation could never be broken by time or distance or the cruel uncertainties of an unforgiving world.